Good morning and welcome to another Seize the Day. I trust that you guys are doing well, that today you had a good night's sleep, and that you're ready to seize the day. I'm grateful to be here with you, and thankful that we have such a glorious morning. This no one can complain about October. Maybe June and July we needed a rowboat, but here in New Hampshire, but it's really pretty nice out today. Thankful for these opportunities. As always, gives us an opportunity just to look a little bit more in the scriptures. We've been in the middle of a whole lot of really good things at Bethany Church. And this past week, we had the opportunity to baptize over 35 people. I baptized, I think, 21 yesterday in Greenland, and there were over 7 in Kittery Point, and over 4 in Raymond. So I think somewhere around 32 people or so were baptized yesterday. Just an awesome day. Church was really well attended. People so excited to see so many of their friends, enter into these waters of baptism. It was really, really just a fun day. So just coming off of that from yesterday, feeling really good. Every time you see these baptisms, it's another reminder that God is doing something really special in the world around us, isn't it? That God is deciding to just use us in this work of reconciliation all over the world, and it is a privilege. We've been continuing a study on the book of Matthew. And we've been calling this study Origins, because it gives us, from Matthew's own words in Matthew 1, verse 33, Matthew 1, verse 18, where he tells us that this is how the birth of Jesus came to pass. And one of the things that you'll find with Matthew is Matthew uses Old Testament texts, but he uses them in a variety of ways. Very often, he'll use them as triggers to what he has been talking about. He's also, I think, relying on his audience, those who are receiving this letter in that first, generation of Jews, receiving this letter with the whole context of cultural triggers that would have reminded them of many things. Where you and I now, it requires a little bit of study, a little bit of understanding of the whole of the Old Testament. And the other thing is, the further we get away from any kind of biblical literacy, it becomes harder and harder, right? Because we don't know the stories. We don't understand the geographies of the land. We don't know the players that are involved. We don't know something of the culture of Israel. And yet, it's all in there in the scriptures. We just got to mine it out. And when we do, we find some really awesome treasure. So in Matthew's book, he's going to give you a number of citations, and I don't want us to lose this main point, because it's an important one. Throughout the opening chapters here of Matthew, he's giving us insight into Old Testament texts. And the reason why he's doing that is because he's couching all of his words regarding this birth of Jesus to these Old Testament passages, so that you and I, when we read them, we recognize that this isn't something just brand new that's happening in our day. This is rather the fulfillment of what God has been sharing from the beginning. Like the words of the prophets, as they began to speak to the people, were always meant to bring people, to a place where they began to enjoy this fellowship with God, that they would worship him in spirit and truth. And so that they would understand this word, they would reflect him well in the world in which they were living. And also that the hope that God would give would also be pronounced, that they would see in Jesus this one who was promised, this great Redeemer. So, for instance, right, the genealogy is important because it shows the lineage of where Jesus came from. And he cannot lay claim to the throne if he was not born in this line. Much like the same way today, right? In those monarchies that require bloodline, you can see how important that is, that who is going to, be heir to this throne. Well, in the Old Testament, we realize that this promise, this covenant that God made with Abraham, that God also made with David, all of those had to be fulfilled, and there are many others that that would unfold as time would go on, but all of those things were necessary. So, hence, you have this genealogy that opens up Matthew. So it's not just, I know it could be strange to read all these names without context, but those names are just demonstrating from Matthew's point of view that Jesus is heir to this throne. And then you get to Joseph and his dream. But the dream is revelation that God is giving to Joseph based on an Old Testament text in Isaiah, right? Where it says, the virgin shall be with child, she shall give birth to a son, and you shall call him Emmanuel. What the angel is saying to Joseph, who was a righteous man, and righteousness meant that they were putting God's word into practice, right? So he understood something of these scriptures. So when he went back, he would have to look at those texts and be reminded again of a promise that God had made. And maybe, like many of us, those it's like watching a really good, suspense movie. There are hints that are being dropped, and you may not be aware of it at the time, but going back and looking, you begin to pick them all up, and you go, "Oh, I should have seen that coming." Well, it's the same with some of these Old Testament prophets. God brought them. People were not maybe paying as close attention. They didn't realize the whole context that was engaged here. And so consequently now you find them in this space where, like Joseph is reminded again of this Old Testament prophet, Isaiah, 700 years before, prophesying the birth of Emmanuel. And then Magi coming from the east. And what did they say? They said, we come to see the king of the Jews. And when asked, where would this king be born? They didn't miss a beat, right? Micah 5:2. And right away, they're pointing to Bethlehem as the place where this ruler and shepherd will come. And we go back now and we read those texts, and we can see so clearly how God says that he's going to raise this one up who would be a shepherd for his people Israel. Again, right? Don't let this escape you. All these Old Testament texts are there to just be like a foundational stone that's placed down, so that the events as they take place in real time were really the fulfillment of all these Old Testament passages. So Magi come, they present gifts to Jesus, gifts fit for a king. As we saw, these were gifts that were offered by the Queen of Sheba to King Solomon. Gold, spices, right? Ointments, perfumes. Like these were gifts fit for a king. And the king of the Jews had been born. Notice what it does, though. In the middle of the night, Joseph is warned in a dream not to leave immediately, and the Magi are told not to go back the way they came, and all of which because this child, his life is being threatened. And so Joseph leaves in the middle of the night, and they bring him down, and then it says, this was to fulfill the words of the prophet that said, out of Egypt I have called my son. And when you go back and look at that text, that was in the book of Hosea. And you begin to realize that the whole context there was not so much prophetic in the sense like this was the Hosea's gospel wasn't a word of prophecy about what was to come. When you go back and read Hosea chapter 11, what you find in that text is God's watch care over his people. That God was reminding Israel in Hosea how he took care of them from the Exodus, how he brought them out, how Moses delivered them from the hands of Pharaoh, how God, despite their rebellion against him, God was patient, kind, long-suffering, merciful, compassionate. And as a result, he met the needs of his people. And God was saying again, this Jesus, this baby, it's the new Moses. He is representative of my people that I'm going to rescue and redeem. And so you begin to realize, okay, here's another text that God is using to demonstrate that. And then we come to Herod and the slaughter of the innocents in Bethlehem, all to regain his own power. You know, I shared this on the weekend, and it might be worth repeating for some of you who perhaps have not been able to really take a look at this passage. But what I would like to do is just give you a little bit of a background as to who this Herod is. And the reason why I'm doing this is because I very often people might look at their faith as a way in which we, as a coping mechanism to the brokenness that's in the world. And while that's true, that the scriptures are here to give us a hope that will never disappoint us, truth on which we can base our life. It's not an isolated truth. God is looking at the world as a whole and is asking us to do the same. When he brings Jesus into this world, it is in an environment that is toxic. Herod, think about it. He would order the slaughter of innocent children, 2 years of age and under, just to hold on to his own power. And Josephus is a historian from these early days, and we have many writings. And Josephus will tell us a little bit more about who this King Herod really was. And I'm going to read something to you, and then you can see how even more heinous this is, regarding how wickedly this evil king would act. There's this is quoted in a book by Richard Lawrence called The Teacher's Commentary. And listen to what he says. He puts it in such a succinct way that I'm just going to read it from him. He says, Herod the Great was the founder of a dynasty that played a key role in gospel history. We meet 4 generations of Herods in the New Testament. Do you catch that? So very often, as you're reading through the Old Testament, you'll hear the name of Herod. So like Herod was one who ordered the death of John the Baptist. Some of you who know your New Testament, you know that John the Baptist was arrested because he confronted Herod and told him that it was unlawful for him to have his brother's wife. And consequently, he was arrested, and he wound up having his he was executed. But that Herod was not the Herod that we're reading about in these early chapters of Matthew. So if you were interested, you'd recognize that there's this dynasty that's taking place within the Herods, and there were 4 of them, and they appear in our New Testament. So we meet the 4 generations of Herods, and it is the founder who ruled from during these days of Jesus, right? Who was then aged and nearing the end of his life that we meet in Matthew chapter 2. So the Herod that we know is coming to the end of his life. He's going to be about 70 years of age. Now, Herod's father had attached himself to Julius Caesar and had been made a Roman citizen, was appointed the ruler of Judea. And so Herod and his brothers were given government roles. Pass the good fortune along, right? Some things never change. It says Herod and his brothers were given these governmental roles, but a decade of battling followed before Herod was proclaimed king of Judea and was able to enforce his rule. As king, Herod was both brutal and decisive, punishing or executing his enemies and rewarding his friends. Rivals were murdered, and when the decisive battle for the Roman Empire was fought, Herod gained the victor's friendship, who happened to be Caesar Augustus, and was given control of additional lands. So, while Herod's power was growing, His control over himself and his family was slipping. Listen to this. Herod had married 10 wives and had a number of sons. And while these sons schemed to gain the throne, his wives hatched plots and counterplots. Nice family, right? Let's see how much we can undermine one another. Herod became more and more suspicious and paranoid, even torturing his son's friends to discover any plots against his own life. Herod's own character as a plotter who never hesitated to resort to murder was being reproduced in his family. And this led to the aging tyrant's own sense of terror and fear. And finally, Herod had the two sons of his favorite wife executed by strangulation in the very city where he married their mother 30 years earlier. His oldest son, he tried to poison his father, and so Herod had him put into prison. And now he's 70 years old, and the historians say that he was stricken with an incurable disease in the latter months of his life. And so it was at this time, sick, old, dying, vengeful, right? So it's at this time that shortly before his death, that Herod hears from wise men who were seeking to worship the newborn king of the Jews. So you see how Herod could be in this mental place, so paranoid, coming to the end of his days, clutching as best he can to the power that he is exerting, looking at all of these threats, that he would be moved as an old man, sick, dying, to kill children? Who does that? But he summoned the wise men, made them promise to report the whereabouts of the child so he can go and worship him. The dying man still struggled to grasp the power that brought him and his family only suspicion, hatred, and death. So God, who always supervenes in this whole process, and throughout this New Testament, you'll see how God will intervene in ways to protect not only Jesus in terms of making sure that he fulfills the mission for which he came, but God's plans and purposes will never be thwarted, never. So God warns the wise men to return home after another way. And God warned Joseph to flee with the Christ child to Egypt. Herod, realizing that the wise men had returned to the east without reporting to him, had all the male children of Bethlehem, 2 years old and under, killed. A heinous crime, but those who study the population of these days report that there's probably 1,000 people in the town of Bethlehem, and logistically, there probably was less than 20 children. One is too many. But sometimes you see these reports or these pictorial representations of this day, and yet it was probably much smaller than we are led to think. But it was then only a few days before Herod's own death. In fact, it was 5 days before he would die. And before he died, listen to what Herod does. The son that he had imprisoned for trying to poison him, he winds up killing. And then he called all the leading Jews of his territory to his palace. And when they came, he imprisoned them. And he gave orders that they were all to be killed the moment that he died, because he wanted to ensure that there would be national mourning at his death rather than rejoicing. So you get all of these leading officials, and he locks them up, and they're all now going to be executed when he passes. Herod's dream of power and glory had turned into a nightmare, and the desperate king struggled to the last to maintain control over his kingdom, lost long after he had lost control of himself. I tell you this because this is the environment in which Jesus is sent. On this holy night, this silent night, right? You know, when the shepherds are watching their sheep, right? In the midst of this night, God brings his son into a world that is being torn upside down And yet he brings them with a message of hope. Jesus comes into the world so that men could be set free, that they could understand something of the will and ways of God, and get ready not only in this life, but for the one to come. If you were God, would you send Jesus into a world this way? I mean, if you're going to write a story of redemption, why not do it like the way we see blockbuster movies, right? The hero comes in and just wipes everybody out and everybody's good. No, it's that might be Hollywood, but that's not God's story. God created this world perfect. And yet through our rebellion, sin has marred every aspect of it. From our own physical well-being to the environment in which we live, there are signs all around us of our own mortality. The evil that's present in the world is not going to go away just by legislation. The evil that's in the world is not going to go away just because you want people to talk nice or use certain words. It's a matter of the reformation of the heart. And the only one that can do that is the one who died on the cross for you and me. His name is Jesus. And so God sends his son, superintending that whole process, protecting him, protecting those who are caring for him, because one day Jesus will grow up and he will fulfill this call that's on his life. He will be the ruler of his people, and he will shepherd all of us as a shepherd does his own flock. So I wanted you to see this, and this text that we read about here in Matthew chapter 2, verse 16. I'd like to read this to you once again. In Matthew 2, it says this: When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Now listen to this in verse 17. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. This time, Matthew is coming right out and referencing the words of the prophet Jeremiah. And he says, a voice is heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. You see this text, and you could understand why that would come to the mind of Matthew right on the heels of speaking of the children being killed 2 years of age and under. And it brings him back to this passage found in Jeremiah 31. It's from a city called Ramah. And what I'd like to do is just give you a little bit of an idea of what that looked like. Here's a map, and I put this little red dot in the middle. You can see on the lower right-hand corner, it's just an outline of the overall topography of the land. So you have the Mediterranean Sea and then the border. And where that little red box is, that's what's enlarged for you on the screen. So that river that's winding down, that's the River Jordan. And if you went all the way up north, that would be the Sea of Galilee, and at the bottom of the river is the Dead Sea. And so, just as a landmark, if you went to the top of the Red Sea and went west, it would come to Jerusalem. And so you see Jerusalem is listed right there. Go about 5 miles south of Jerusalem and you find Bethlehem. Go 5 miles north of Jerusalem, and there you have this red dot called Ramah. Why this is significant is what is something that I'd like to share with you now, and that comes that comes to us from another passage. And so in Jeremiah, in Jeremiah 39, and verse 1 and then 8 and 9, there's a summary of what took place in Israel's history. Jeremiah was a prophet that was telling people of the coming destruction that was about to befall them. And it would lead to the exile, one of those pivotal, moments in Israel's history, much the same way that we think of the Passover and the Exodus, where God drew his people out of Egypt. Now, many years later, we're going to find that God's going to send the Babylonians, and the Babylonians are going to capture the cities of Jerusalem, its temple, and all the people are going to be exiled. Jeremiah is writing about that, and he says this in Jeremiah 39, verse 1. He says, "This is how Jerusalem was taken." It says, the king Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, marched against Jerusalem with his whole army and laid siege to it. The Babylonians set fire to the royal palace and the houses of the people and broke down the walls of Jerusalem. The commander of the imperial guard carried into exile to Babylon the people who remained in the city, along with those who had gone over to him and the rest of the people. Why am I reading this to you? Because if you follow this all the way down, what you find is that the city that they carried everyone to was the city of Ramah. So going back to our map, Ramah would be the first stop coming out of Jerusalem, where all of the people, all these exiles were gathered, and then they were forced to march all the way back to Babylon. And along the way, they would be scattered throughout the land, dispersed throughout the whole land. So Ramah was a place in their history that just underscored all that was happening to the people of God. Jeremiah in chapter 40 in verse 1 would say this, that all the captives from Jerusalem and Judah who were being carried off into exile were kept at Ramah. So now when you read this text and you hear these words, that a voice is heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning. Rachel, right, one of the daughters, one of the wives of Israel, it says Rachel is weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. Another one of those little historical points, the wife of Jacob, Rachel, she's buried right outside of Ramah. And so hence that reference, because for those first century Jews, this history mattered to them, right? They understood, just like, we talk about Plymouth Rock, right? Or other places here in the United States that have historical meaning. Well, Rachel's burial tomb was nearby. And this text, that's a quotation from Jeremiah, is triggered into the mind of Matthew. Why is that trigger there? Well, tomorrow I'd like to continue this story and share a little bit more. And it's not what you might think. So tomorrow we'll get together. We'll talk a little bit more. But for today, I just want you to recognize Old Testament texts are meant to just verify this work that God is doing through his Son. All these historical references are meant to give us confidence that the one who was born that day in Bethlehem truly is the King of Kings. It'll give us confidence then to listen to the words that Jesus says and to recognize that he is speaking with authority. And that authority, it calls us to live a life that reflects that in the way in which we show our love for him and our love for neighbor. So go today, seize the day, and tomorrow we'll get together and we'll find the rest of the story here in Jeremiah. So God bless you. Lord willing, we'll see each other again tomorrow. As always, it's a privilege and just want you to know God is good all the time. God bless.